Welcome, true believers, to a story that will forever be remembered as Spider-Man's darkest hour. Tonight, we journey through one of the most heartbreaking moments in superhero history, a night when love and heroism collided on the Brooklyn Bridge, and the world learned that even the mightiest heroes cannot save everyone. This is the story of Gwen Stacy, the brilliant golden-haired young woman who captured Peter Parker's heart, and the Green Goblin, the cackling madman whose twisted revenge would shatter that heart forever. We'll walk gently through the love that bloomed between two young souls, the friendship that turned to madness, and the terrible moment when a hero's greatest power proved not quite enough to prevent tragedy. So settle in, get comfortable, and let your mind drift back to a time when comic books dared to show that not every story has a happy ending, that sometimes the cost of being a hero is measured in the tears we shed for those we couldn't save. There's no rush here, no need to remember every detail. Just let the story carry you like a web line through the night as we explore how one terrible night changed Spider-Man and comic book storytelling forever. The story of Gwen Stacy begins not with tragedy, but with light, with the kind of pure, uncomplicated brightness that seems too good to be true in the complicated world that Peter Parker inhabits. When she first appears in his life during his early days at Empire State University, she represents everything that has been missing from his experience, the possibility of genuine connection with someone who sees past his awkward exterior to the good heart beneath, someone whose natural kindness and intelligence make the burden of his secret identity feel, for the first time, like something he might be able to share. Gwen's entrance into Peter's world comes at a moment when he desperately needs exactly what she offers. The high school years are behind him, with all their painful memories of Flash Thompson's bullying and the loneliness of being the class brain that nobody wanted to know. His relationship with Betty Brant has run its course, complicated by the age difference and by Peter's inability to be completely honest about his life and activities. The weight of Uncle Ben's death still presses on his heart, and the responsibility of being Spider-Man has begun to feel like a burden that isolates him from the normal joys and connections that other young people take for granted. Into this landscape of grief and duty walks Gwen Stacy, and she changes everything simply by being herself. There's nothing calculated or artificial about her appeal. She doesn't try to be mysterious or play games with Peter's affections. She is, in the most beautiful sense, exactly who she appears to be, a smart, caring, genuine person who treats everyone with respect and kindness, who laughs easily and speaks honestly, who makes the people around her feel valued and understood. Her appearance is striking in its classic wholesome beauty. The golden blonde hair that frames her face seems to catch and hold light, creating an almost luminous quality that makes her stand out in any crowd. But it's not her physical beauty that captures Peter's attention and holds it. It's the warmth in her smile, the intelligence in her eyes, the way she listens when people speak as if their words truly matter to her. She possesses that rare quality of making everyone she encounters feel like they're the most important person in the room, not through flattery or manipulation, but through genuine interest and care. The first conversations between Peter and Gwen crackle with the kind of natural chemistry that cannot be forced or faked. They discover shared interests in science, both of them drawn to the beauty of understanding how the world works at its most fundamental levels. Peter finds himself able to discuss complex scientific concepts without feeling like he's showing off or making someone uncomfortable with his intelligence. Gwen matches his knowledge and enthusiasm, bringing her own perspectives and insights that challenge and delight him, but their connection goes deeper than intellectual compatibility. Gwen possesses an emotional intelligence and maturity that allows her to perceive the sadness that Peter carries beneath his quick wit and self-deprecating humour. She notices the way his smile sometimes doesn't quite reach his eyes, the moments when he seems to be carrying burdens far heavier than any college student should bear. Rather than prying or demanding explanations for his obvious secrets, she offers something more valuable: acceptance and patience, the implicit message that, whenever he's ready to share what troubles him, she'll be there to listen without judgment. The development of their relationship unfolds with the kind of natural progression that feels inevitable and right. Study sessions in the library become coffee dates at the student union. Coffee dates become long walks through the city, talking about everything and nothing, discovering the 1,000 small compatibilities that make two people want to spend all their time together. Peter finds himself looking forward to seeing Gwen with an intensity that both thrills and frightens him, aware that the deeper his feelings grow, the more complicated his double life becomes. Gwen's background provides context for the person she's become and the values she holds. Her father, Captain George Stacy, is a police captain whose dedication to justice and public service mirrors Peter's own moral compass in profound ways. From him, Gwen has learned that protecting others is not just a job but a calling, that people with the ability to help have an obligation to use that ability wisely and well. These lessons resonate deeply with Peter's understanding of responsibility, creating another layer of connection between them. Captain Stacy himself becomes an important figure in Peter's life, offering the kind of paternal guidance and respect that Peter has missed since Uncle Ben's death. The captain's professional interest in Spider-Man creates an unusual dynamic, as he is one of the few law enforcement officials who genuinely appreciates the web-slinger's efforts and recognizes the moral integrity that guides his actions. The conversations between Captain Stacy and Peter Parker, though never explicitly acknowledging what both of them suspect about Peter's secret identity, become opportunities for the older man to share wisdom about courage, duty, and the complex nature of heroism in the modern world. The Stacy household, warm and welcoming, provides Peter with a glimpse of the kind of family life he has always wanted. Dinners at their home are filled with lively conversation, good food, and the easy affection of people who genuinely enjoy each other's company. Gwen's mother treats Peter with maternal warmth, asking about his studies and his aunt, making him feel valued and cared for in ways that ease the loneliness that has marked so much of his life. As Peter and Gwen's relationship deepens into something approaching real love, Peter finds himself contemplating possibilities he had thought were closed to him. Could he have both a heroic mission and a genuine romantic partnership? Could someone as good and pure as Gwen truly accept the complications and dangers that come with loving Spider-Man? The hope that maybe, just maybe, he could have the kind of happiness that other people take for granted begins to bloom in his heart. Fragile and precious and terrifying in its intensity. The physical attraction between them is undeniable, but it's tempered and enriched by genuine friendship and deep respect. Their kisses are sweet and filled with promise, hinting at the deeper intimacy that might develop as their relationship matures. Peter finds himself thinking about a future with Gwen, imagining marriage and family and the kind of normal life that has always seemed impossible for someone with his responsibilities. But even in these happiest moments, shadows lurk at the edges of their relationship. Peter's mysterious absences and unexplained injuries create confusion and hurt that Gwen tries to hide but cannot completely suppress. She knows he's keeping secrets from her, and while she trusts that he has good reasons, the barrier between them creates a subtle distance that prevents complete intimacy. Peter wants desperately to tell her the truth, to share every part of himself with this woman he loves, but the memory of what happened to Uncle Ben when his secret-keeping had consequences makes him cautious and afraid. The college environment where their romance blossoms provides both opportunities and challenges for their relationship. Harry Osborn, Peter's best friend and roommate, watches the development of Peter and Gwen's romance with mixed feelings. He's happy for his friend, but also aware that Peter's growing commitment to Gwen means less time and attention for their friendship. The complex dynamics of young adult relationships, the competing demands of romance, friendship, and individual identity create tensions that none of them fully understand how to navigate. Mary Jane Watson, the vibrant red-headed party girl who also moves in their social circle, represents a kind of alternative to everything Gwen embodies. Where Gwen is serious and thoughtful, Mary Jane is spontaneous and carefree. Where Gwen seeks deep emotional connection, Mary Jane seems content with surface-level fun and excitement. Peter is aware of Mary Jane's appeal, the way her energy and beauty draw attention wherever she goes, but his heart belongs completely to Gwen, to her gentleness, and her wisdom, and her unwavering goodness. The time that Peter and Gwen spend together becomes a sanctuary from the chaos and danger of his Spider-Man activities. In her presence, he can almost forget the weight of responsibility that presses on his shoulders, can almost believe that he's just a normal young man falling in love with an extraordinary young woman. Their conversations range from the deeply serious to the playfully silly, covering everything from their career aspirations to their favourite foods, from their philosophical beliefs to their most embarrassing childhood memories. Gwen's ambition to make a difference in the world through science and education aligns perfectly with Peter's own desire to use his intelligence for the greater good. They dream together about the kind of impact they might have, the discoveries they might make, the lives they might improve through their work. These shared dreams create a vision of the future that feels both inspiring and achievable, a life built on love, purpose, and mutual support. The little rituals they develop together, their favourite coffee shop where they always sit at the same table, the park bench where they first kissed, the routine of walking Gwen home after their dates, create a sense of stability and continuity that Peter has rarely experienced in his chaotic life. These small, ordinary moments of domestic happiness become precious to him, evidence that despite everything complicated and dangerous in his world, he has found something pure and good worth protecting. But underneath the happiness and hope, a terrible truth is gathering its strength, preparing to strike. Norman Osborn, Harry's father and the man behind the Green Goblin's mask, has been watching and planning, his madness growing more focused and dangerous with each passing day. His knowledge of Peter's secret identity, gained during an earlier encounter and then lost to chemically induced amnesia, is beginning to resurface in fragments and flashes. And in his twisted psychology, Gwen Stacy has been identified as the perfect target, the one person whose loss would destroy Peter Parker more completely than any physical defeat ever could. The stage is being set for tragedy. Though none of the players yet understand the roles they will be forced to play, Peter loves Gwen with all his heart, believing that their future together is just beginning. Gwen loves Peter with equal intensity, trusting that whatever secrets he keeps, they don't change the fundamental goodness she sees in him. Captain Stacy watches over his daughter with paternal pride and protective concern, unaware that his own death in service to the city he loves will soon leave Gwen without his guidance and protection. The golden days of their courtship are numbered, though neither Peter nor Gwen can know this. Each moment of happiness they share, each plan they make for their future, each promise they exchange, is both genuine and heartbreaking, because we who know the story understand what they cannot, that their time together is running out, that the bridge is waiting, that the fall is coming, and that nothing Peter does, no amount of love or power or desperate heroism, will be enough to prevent the tragedy that will define both their lives. The shadow that will ultimately destroy Gwen Stacy's world begins with a man who was once Peter Parker's closest friend, a friendship forged in the uncertain early days of college, when both young men were trying to find their place in a world that seemed too large and too complicated to navigate alone. Harry Osborn enters Peter's life as a study in contrasts, the wealthy son of a powerful industrialist paired with the scholarship student from Queen's, two young men who should have nothing in common, but who discover in each other something essential that they both need, genuine friendship unburdened by expectations or ulterior motives. Harry's life, for all its material advantages and social privileges, has been marked by a profound loneliness that money cannot cure and status cannot ease. His father, Norman Osborn, is a titan of industry whose empire of chemical manufacturing and technological innovation has made the Osborn name synonymous with success and power throughout New York City. But Norman's dedication to his business empire has come at a terrible cost to his relationship with his son, creating a distance between them that all of Harry's achievements and attempts to earn approval cannot seem to bridge. The Osborn mansion, a sprawling estate that speaks of generations of wealth and influence, should be a home filled with warmth and family connection. Instead, it feels more like a museum, beautiful and impressive, but somehow empty of the human presence that makes a house into a home. Harry grows up surrounded by servants and tutors, by expensive possessions and exclusive opportunities, but what he lacks is the simple gift of a father's unconditional love and genuine interest in who he is rather than what he might become. Norman Osborn's expectations for his son are simultaneously vague and impossibly high. He wants Harry to be worthy of the Osborn legacy, to demonstrate the kind of brilliance and drive that built the family fortune, but he provides little guidance or support for how to achieve these nebulous goals. Every conversation between father and son carries an undercurrent of disappointment, as if Harry's very existence is a reminder of potentials unfulfilled and promises broken. The psychological pressure of living under these expectations begins to manifest in Harry's behaviour during his teenage years. He develops patterns of seeking approval and validation from external sources, desperately trying to prove his worth through academic achievement, social success, and the cultivation of friendships with people he hopes will reflect well on him. But beneath the confident exterior he presents to the world, there's a fragility, a sense that without constant external validation, he might simply cease to exist in any meaningful way. Peter's friendship offers Harry something he has never experienced before, acceptance based not on his family name or his wealth, but on who he is as a person. Peter doesn't care about the Osborn fortune or the social advantages that Harry can provide. He values Harry for his humour, his loyalty, and the genuine kindness that emerges when Harry feels safe enough to let down his guard. This unconditional acceptance is so foreign to Harry's experience that at first he doesn't quite know how to receive it, suspecting that Peter must want something, must have some hidden agenda that will eventually be revealed. But Peter's motivations are exactly as simple as they appear. He likes Harry, enjoys his company, appreciates his friendship. The two young men develop the kind of easy camaraderie that makes even mundane activities feel enjoyable and meaningful. Study sessions become opportunities for conversation and laughter. Meals together provide chances to share dreams and frustrations. The simple act of having a friend who genuinely cares about your well-being, who notices when you're troubled and asks if you're okay, transforms Harry's experience of the world in profound ways. The apartment that Peter and Harry share during their college years becomes a sanctuary for both of them, a space where they can be themselves without the pressures and expectations that define their interactions with the outside world. For Peter, it's a place where he can almost forget the weight of his Spider-Man responsibilities and simply be a college student navigating the normal challenges of young adulthood. For Harry, it's the first home he's ever had that feels warm and welcoming, where he's valued for who he is rather than what his name represents. The conversations that take place in that apartment, late at night when the city outside grows quiet and the barriers between people naturally lower, become opportunities for both young men to explore their fears, their hopes, their understanding of what it means to be a good person in a complicated world. Harry talks about his father with a mixture of love and resentment, wanting desperately to earn Norman's approval, while also recognizing the unfairness of the constant judgment and criticism. Peter listens with empathy born from his own experience of loss, understanding what it means to long for a father figure's guidance and support. Peter's inability to share the full truth of his life with Harry creates a barrier between them that Peter finds increasingly painful. Here is someone who has become like a brother to him, someone he trusts and cares about deeply, and yet he cannot reveal the most important and defining aspect of his identity. The lies and evasions required to maintain his secret create a subtle distance that Harry notices but cannot understand, interpreting Peter's mysterious absences and unexplained injuries as evidence of some personal problem or hidden life that Peter doesn't trust him enough to share. Harry's relationship with his father begins to deteriorate more seriously during the college years, as Norman's expectations become more explicit and more impossible to meet. Norman wants Harry to prepare for taking over Oscorp Industries, to demonstrate the kind of business acumen and strategic thinking that the role will require. But Harry's interests lie elsewhere, in literature and art rather than chemistry and commerce. The mismatch between what Norman demands and what Harry can genuinely offer creates friction that gradually erodes what little connection exists between them. The pressure of disappointing his father, combined with the normal stresses of college life and the complications of young adult relationships, begins to push Harry toward unhealthy coping mechanisms. He starts drinking more heavily at parties, using alcohol as a way to silence the critical voice in his head that constantly reminds him of his inadequacies. The drinking is social at first, just part of the college experience, but gradually it becomes something more concerning, a dependence that Harry himself doesn't fully recognize or acknowledge. Norman Osborn's own psychological state during this period is deteriorating in ways that neither Harry nor Peter can fully perceive. The respectable businessman and philanthropist that the world sees is increasingly at war with something darker and more dangerous lurking beneath the surface of his consciousness. The chemical accident that originally transformed him into the Green Goblin and the subsequent amnesia that erased his memories of that transformation has left psychological scars that are beginning to crack and bleed. The stress of managing Oscorp Industries, combined with business challenges and competitive pressures that threaten the company's dominance, activates Norman's tendency toward paranoia and grandiosity. He begins to see conspiracies and betrayals everywhere, to interpret normal business competition as personal attacks that require ruthless responses. The line between legitimate business practices and criminal behavior begins to blur in his mind as he convinces himself that the rules that govern ordinary people don't apply to someone of his intelligence and importance. The fragmentary memories of his time as the Green Goblin begin to surface in Norman's dreams and moments of stress, appearing as disconnected images and emotions that he cannot quite place or understand. He remembers the sensation of power, the exhilaration of being free from the constraints of morality and social expectation. He remembers hating Spider-Man with an intensity that seems disproportionate to anything the web-slinger has actually done to Norman Osborn the businessman. These memories trouble and confuse him, suggesting a hidden history that his conscious mind cannot access. The triggers that gradually restore Norman's full memories and reactivate his Green Goblin persona are varied and accumulating. Each business setback, each perceived slight from competitors or colleagues, each disappointment in Harry's development adds another crack to the dam holding back his madness. The sight of Spider-Man in news footage creates feelings of rage and hatred that Norman cannot rationally explain. The presence of Peter Parker in his home, visiting Harry or attending family functions, generates an inexplicable unease and suspicion that Norman tries to dismiss but cannot entirely ignore. The full restoration of Norman's memories doesn't happen all at once, but rather through a series of triggering events that gradually break down the mental barriers created by his chemically induced amnesia. A particularly stressful board meeting, where Norman feels his authority being questioned and his decisions being second-guessed, creates a moment of such intense anger that something breaks loose in his mind. The memories come flooding back, not gently or gradually, but in an overwhelming torrent that temporarily incapacitates him with their intensity and clarity. He remembers everything: the creation of the Goblin formula, intended to enhance human strength and intelligence, but which instead created a monster; the transformation that gave him superhuman abilities, but also amplified his worst impulses and removed his inhibitions; the battles with Spider-Man, the elaborate schemes, the intoxicating sensation of being more than human, of being above the petty rules and limitations that constrain ordinary people. And most importantly, most dangerously, he remembers discovering Peter Parker's secret identity. The knowledge that his son's best friend and the web-slinging hero are the same person. The restoration of these memories transforms Norman's understanding of his world and his relationships in fundamental ways. Everything that has happened since his apparent recovery from the Green Goblin transformation is recontextualized through the lens of this knowledge. Peter's presence in Harry's life, which Norman had tolerated with mild approval, now appears as a kind of infiltration, the enemy hiding in plain sight within the Osborn family circle. The friendship between the two young men, which had seemed innocent and even beneficial for Harry, now strikes Norman as a betrayal, Peter using his connection to Harry to gather intelligence, or perhaps to gloat about his victories over the Green Goblin. The paranoia and rage that characterize Norman's Green Goblin persona reassert themselves with renewed intensity, focused now not just on Spider-Man the hero, but on Peter Parker, the person. Norman begins to see his conflict with Spider-Man as something deeply personal, a battle not just between hero and villain, but between two men competing for dominance in overlapping spheres of influence. Peter has Harry's friendship and loyalty, has Gwen's love, has the city's admiration as Spider-Man, while Norman has only his business empire and a son who can barely hide his disappointment in his father. The decision to target Gwen Stacy rather than Harry or Aunt May in his revenge scheme reflects Norman's cold calculation about what would hurt Peter the most. Aunt May represents Peter's past, his sense of obligation and family duty. Harry represents friendship and loyalty. But Gwen represents Peter's future, his hope for happiness and normalcy despite his heroic responsibilities. Destroying that hope, killing the woman Peter loves and making him live with the consequences, strikes Norman as a far more elegant and devastating form of revenge than simply killing Peter himself. The planning that goes into Norman's scheme is meticulous and psychologically sophisticated. Drawing on his intimate knowledge of Peter's psychology and his understanding of Spider-Man's abilities and limitations, he knows that simply threatening Gwen won't be enough, that Peter's powers would allow him to protect her from most conventional dangers. The plan must involve surprise, must exploit Peter's emotional vulnerabilities, must create a situation where even Spider-Man's extraordinary abilities prove insufficient to prevent tragedy. Harry's deteriorating mental state during this period, his increasing reliance on alcohol and his growing depression about his inability to meet his father's expectations, creates additional complications that Norman initially sees as inconvenient, but gradually begins to view as potentially useful. A son struggling with addiction and self-doubt might make a more sympathetic figure, might help deflect suspicion from Norman if anything were to happen that required explanations to authorities or the public. The relationship between Harry and Gwen during this period is marked by a kind of melancholy awareness that their close friendship is being altered by Gwen's romantic relationship with Peter. Harry cares about Gwen deeply, values her kindness, and her genuine interest in his well-being, but her obvious love for Peter creates a distance that Harry feels but cannot articulate. He's happy for his friends, wants them to find joy together. But he also feels increasingly isolated as the two people he cares about most become more absorbed in each other. Peter's awareness of Harry's struggles creates guilt and concern that add to the burden he already carries. He wants to help his friend, to provide the support and understanding that might help Harry find healthier ways of coping with his problems. But Peter's dual identity and the time demands of his Spider-Man activities limit his availability and attention. The moments when Harry most needs a friend to talk to are often the moments when Peter is swinging through the city dealing with criminal threats, creating a pattern of absence and unavailability that Harry interprets as evidence that Peter doesn't really care as much as he claims. The final weeks before the tragedy on the Brooklyn Bridge are marked by a gathering sense of danger and unease that Peter cannot quite identify or address. His spider sense, that inexplicable early warning system that alerts him to threats before they become apparent to his normal senses, tingles with increasing frequency even when there's no immediate danger visible. Something is coming, some threat is building, but Peter cannot determine what it is or how to prepare for it. Norman's preparations for his grand revenge involve not just planning the attack on Gwen, but also ensuring that his own involvement will be difficult to prove or trace. The Green Goblin costume and equipment are retrieved from their hiding places and carefully maintained. The glider is tested and modified to ensure maximum speed and maneuverability. The pumpkin bombs and other weapons are prepared and calibrated. Every detail is considered, every contingency planned for, because Norman knows that he will only have one chance to inflict this particular kind of damage on Peter Parker. The choice of the Brooklyn Bridge as the site of the final confrontation is both symbolic and practical. The bridge's height creates opportunities for the kind of fall that even Spider-Man might not be able to prevent or survive. The complex structure provides places to hide and angles of approach that could allow Norman to strike before Peter can fully react. And symbolically, the bridge represents connection and crossing over, making it a grimly appropriate location for the moment when Peter Parker crosses from hope to despair. From the belief that love can triumph over adversity to the knowledge that sometimes tragedy strikes, despite everyone's best efforts to prevent it. Gwen's life during these final weeks before the bridge is marked by happiness and hope that make what's coming even more heartbreaking. She's in love with a man who makes her feel valued and understood. Her studies are going well, suggesting a bright future in scientific research or education. Her relationship with her father remains strong and supportive, providing her with a foundation of family love that allows her to navigate the complexities of young adulthood with confidence and grace. She has friends, purpose, prospects for a meaningful career. Everything in her life seems to be coming together in ways that suggest a beautiful future unfolding before her. The last conversation between Gwen and her father, Captain George Stacy, takes place just days before the bridge, and it carries a weight of foreshadowing that neither of them recognizes at the time. They talk about her relationship with Peter, about her hopes for the future, about the importance of choosing a partner who shares your values and commitments. Captain Stacy expresses his approval of Peter, seeing in the young man qualities of integrity and courage that he values in his own work as a police officer. He tells Gwen that he trusts her judgment, that he knows she'll make good choices about her life and her relationships. Peter and Gwen's last normal date before everything changes is ordinary in the best possible way, filled with the small pleasures and easy companionship that characterize a healthy, loving relationship. They see a movie, share dinner at their favourite restaurant, walk hand in hand through the city streets talking about nothing particularly important and everything that matters. Peter finds himself thinking that he wants this feeling, this sense of contentment and connection, to last forever. Gwen smiles up at him with such trust and affection that Peter's heart aches with love and with the terrible knowledge of how much he has to lose. The web of fate is drawing tighter, pulling all the players toward the Brooklyn Bridge and the terrible scene that will unfold there. Norman Osborn, consumed by madness and hatred, finalizes his preparations for revenge. Harry Osborn, lost in his own struggles with addiction and self-worth, remains unaware of the storm gathering around the people he loves. Captain Stacy continues his work protecting the city, not knowing that his previous death in service to that mission has already occurred in some tellings of the story, leaving Gwen without his protection. And Peter Parker, desperately in love and hopeful about the future, has no idea that the greatest test of his life is approaching, a test that he will fail despite his best efforts, despite his powers, despite his love. The stage is set, the actors are in place, the bridge is waiting. And soon, very soon, the golden girl who brought light into Peter Parker's world will fall, and nothing, not superhuman strength or lightning reflexes or desperate love, will be enough to save her. The transformation of Norman Osborn back into the Green Goblin is not a sudden event, but a gradual descent that mirrors the slow crumbling of a dam under relentless pressure. Each restored memory acts as another crack in the barrier separating Norman's civilized businessman persona from the cackling monster that lurks beneath. The process is both terrifying and exhilarating for Norman, who experiences the return of his goblin identity as a kind of homecoming, a return to his true self after being trapped in the prison of conventional morality and social expectation. The first full manifestation of the Green Goblin's return happens in the privacy of Norman's personal laboratory, a secret facility hidden beneath the Osborn mansion, where he conducts experiments that the board of directors and regulatory authorities would never approve. Surrounded by bubbling chemicals and sophisticated equipment, Norman retrieves the goblin formula from its hiding place and holds it up to the light, watching the viscous green liquid swirl within its container. The formula represents both scientific achievement and terrible corruption, the pinnacle of Norman's research and the source of his damnation. The decision to inject himself with the formula again, knowing full well what it will do to his mind and his moral restraints, reveals the depth of Norman's obsession with revenge against Spider-Man. He understands that the formula will transform him, will remove the inhibitions and ethical considerations that might prevent him from carrying out his plan. But he views this transformation not as a loss of self, but as a liberation, a shedding of the weak, constrained version of himself that society demands he maintain. The needle pierces his skin, the formula enters his bloodstream, and Norman Osborn willingly surrenders to the monster he knows he will become. The physical changes that accompany the formula's effects are immediate and dramatic. Norman's already considerable strength multiplies several times over, giving him the power to bend steel bars and shatter concrete with his bare hands. His reflexes sharpen to superhuman levels, allowing him to react to threats and opportunities with snake-like quickness. His healing ability accelerates, meaning that injuries that would incapacitate a normal person for weeks will trouble him for only hours or days. But the most significant changes are psychological, as the formula strips away the veneer of civilization and releases the purid that Norman has spent his entire adult life suppressing. The Green Goblin persona that emerges from Norman's chemically induced transformation is both continuous with his original personality and somehow more intense, more focused, more purely malevolent. All of Norman's resentments and frustrations, his anger at perceived slights, and his contempt for people he considers inferior crystallize into a burning hatred directed primarily at Spider-Man, but extending to encompass anyone who stands in the way of his revenge. The Goblin doesn't just want to defeat Spider-Man in combat or expose his secret identity to the world. He wants to destroy Peter Parker's soul, to take from him everything that makes life worth living and force him to continue existing in a state of perpetual grief and guilt. The costume that Norman creates for his return as the Green Goblin is both theatrical and terrifying, designed to inspire fear and create a memorable visual impact. The purple and green colour scheme deliberately clashes, creating a sense of wrongness and corruption. The mask, with its exaggerated features and manic grin, transforms Norman into something that appears more demon than human. The pointed ears and glowing eyes add to the supernatural appearance, making the goblin seem like something out of nightmare rather than a product of science and madness. The glider that serves as the goblin's primary mode of transportation is a masterpiece of engineering, combining advanced aerodynamics with military-grade weaponry. The batwing shape allows for incredible maneuverability, enabling tight turns and sudden changes in altitude that would be impossible with conventional aircraft. The propulsion system, powered by Norman's own chemical innovations, provides both speed and stealth, allowing the goblin to appear suddenly out of the night sky like a predatory bird descending on unsuspecting prey. Mounted on the glider are various weapon systems, from conventional explosives to more exotic devices that Norman has developed specifically for use against someone with Spider-Man's abilities. The pumpkin bombs that become the Green Goblin's signature weapons are marvels of miniaturization and destructive engineering. Each orange sphere, styled to look like a jack-o'-lantern and thereby adding to the Goblin's Halloween-themed terror, contains enough explosive force to demolish a small building. But Norman has developed multiple variants for different tactical situations. Some release thick smoke that obscures vision and confuses Spider-Man's spider sense. Others emit high-frequency sounds designed to cause disorientation and nausea. Still others contain powerful adhesives that can trap even someone with Spider-Man's strength, buying the goblin precious seconds to press his advantage. The razor bats, another signature weapon in the goblin's arsenal, serve no practical purpose beyond their psychological impact. These bat-shaped projectiles, sharp enough to slice through steel, are designed purely to terrify and to reinforce the goblin's supernatural appearance. When they whistle through the air toward their target, they create an audio signature that triggers primal fears of airborne predators. Norman delights in this kind of psychological warfare, understanding that fear can be as effective a weapon as any explosive or blade. The period between Norman's full transformation into the Green Goblin and the attack on Gwen Stacy is marked by careful planning and meticulous preparation. The Goblin understands that he's facing an opponent with superhuman reflexes, a danger warning sense that borders on precognition, and years of combat experience against exotic threats. Any plan that relies solely on brute force or simple ambush is doomed to failure. The key to success lies in exploiting Peter's emotional vulnerabilities, in creating a situation where his love for Gwen overrides his tactical judgment and clouds his usually sharp combat instincts. Norman's surveillance of Peter and Gwen during this planning period is exhaustive and invasive, utilizing all the resources that his wealth and corporate connections provide. Private investigators track their movements and document their routines. Sophisticated listening devices capture their conversations, revealing the depth of their feelings for each other and the plans they're making for their future together. Norman learns Gwen's class schedule, her favourite places to study, the routes she typically takes when walking home. Every detail is catalogued and analysed, searching for the perfect opportunity to strike. The psychological state of the Green Goblin during this surveillance period is fascinating and disturbing in equal measure. Norman experiences the planning and preparation as a kind of artistic endeavour. Taking genuine pleasure in the elegance and sophistication of his scheme, he sees himself as a superior intellect orchestrating a grand performance, with Spider-Man and Gwen as unwitting actors in a tragedy that will demonstrate the Goblin's supremacy over both conventional heroes and ordinary human decency. The suffering he plans to inflict is not just a means to an end, but an end in itself, something to be savoured and appreciated for its own sake. The choice to kidnap Gwen rather than simply killing her immediately reflects Norman's understanding of how to maximise Peter's anguish. A sudden, unexpected death might shock and grieve Peter, but it wouldn't provide the same opportunity for prolonged torment and psychological warfare. By taking Gwen alive and forcing Peter to attempt a rescue, Norman creates a scenario where hope and fear battle within Peter's heart, where every decision carries the weight of life and death consequences, where Peter must face the terrible possibility that his powers might not be enough to save the woman he loves. The actual kidnapping is executed with careful timing and ruthless efficiency. Norman waits for a moment when Gwen is alone and vulnerable, walking from her final class of the day toward the library where she has planned to meet Peter for an evening study session. The goblin descends from the sky on his glider, moving fast enough that Gwen has no time to scream or run before he's upon her. A cloth soaked in a fast-acting sedative is pressed over her nose and mouth, and within seconds her struggles cease as unconsciousness claims her. The sight of the Green Goblin carrying Gwen's limp form through the evening sky is witnessed by several bystanders, who immediately call the police with reports of a monster kidnapping a young woman. The descriptions are fragmentary and confused, coloured by fear and disbelief, but they all agree on the essential facts. A creature in a Halloween costume riding some kind of flying platform has taken a blonde college student and flown off toward the Brooklyn waterfront. The police, including officers who remember Captain George Stacy's respect for Spider-Man, immediately hope that the web-slinger will learn of the kidnapping and intervene before the worst can happen. Peter's discovery that Gwen has been taken comes not through any official channel, but through his spider sense, that inexplicable early warning system that has saved his life countless times. He's waiting for her at their agreed meeting place in the library when suddenly, his entire body floods with alarm signals, the familiar tingling sensation amplified to an intensity he's rarely experienced. Something is terribly wrong, and that something involves Gwen. He knows this with the same certainty that he knows his own name, even though he has no rational explanation for the knowledge. The panic that seizes Peter in this moment is unlike anything he's felt since Uncle Ben's death. His hands shake as he tries to call Gwen's phone, only to have it ring and ring without answer. He calls her dorm room, her father's house, any place she might have gone, but no one has seen her or heard from her. The sick feeling in his stomach intensifies with each failed attempt to reach her, the certainty growing that something terrible has happened and that he may already be too late to prevent it. The message from the Green Goblin arrives through channels designed to ensure that Spider-Man will receive it quickly. A pumpkin bomb is left at the Daily Bugle offices, timed to explode harmlessly but noisily during the evening when few people are present. Attached to the bomb is a note written in Norman's precise handwriting, though the words are pure goblin in their mocking cruelty. Your girlfriend is waiting for you at the bridge, Spider-Man. Come alone, come quickly, and maybe, just maybe, you'll be in time to save her, or maybe you'll just be in time to watch her fall. Either way, it should be entertaining. The rage that fills Peter when he reads this message is almost overwhelming, threatening to override the tactical thinking and careful planning that effective heroism requires. The goblin has Gwen, has threatened her life, has dared Peter to try to save her. Every instinct screams at him to rush to the bridge immediately, to confront his enemy and rescue the woman he loves. But years of experience fighting cunning opponents have taught Peter that acting on pure emotion usually leads to mistakes and missed opportunities. He forces himself to take a breath, to think about what the goblin wants and how to deny him that satisfaction. The flight to the Brooklyn Bridge is one of the longest journeys of Peter's life, though it takes only minutes to cross the distance from the Bugle offices to the bridge's distinctive towers. Each swing of his web lines feels too slow. Each building he passes a maddening delay between him and Gwen. His mind races with possibilities and plans, trying to anticipate the goblin's strategy and prepare countermeasures. He knows this is a trap, knows that the goblin wants him to act rashly and emotionally. But knowing the trap exists doesn't make it any less effective when the bait is someone you love more than your own life. The Brooklyn Bridge, illuminated by streetlights and car headlights, stretches across the East River like a magnificent monument to human engineering and ambition. The Gothic towers that support the suspension cables rise majestically into the night sky, their arches and stonework creating shadows and hiding places where danger might lurk. The wooden walkway that runs down the centre of the bridge provides pedestrians with spectacular views of the city and the water, but tonight it will serve as the stage for a tragedy that will haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. Spider-Man's arrival at the bridge is cautious and controlled, despite the screaming urgency of his need to find Gwen and ensure her safety. He approaches from above, swinging along the suspension cables and using the bridge's structure to mask his presence until he can assess the situation and identify the threats. His spider sense provides constant feedback about danger sources, but the signals are confused and overlapping, suggesting multiple threats, or perhaps a single threat moving unpredictably through the bridge's complex geometry. The sight that greets Peter when he finally locates Gwen makes his heart stop and his breath catch in his throat. She's unconscious, her golden hair stirring slightly in the wind that blows across the river, her body limp and helpless. The goblin has positioned her on one of the suspension cables high above the bridge deck, a precarious perch from which any movement or disturbance might send her plummeting toward the water far below. The message is clear and cruel. One wrong move, one miscalculation, and Gwen will fall to her death before Peter can reach her. The Green Goblin himself stands on his glider hovering near the bridge's main tower, positioned so that he can reach Gwen before Spider-Man could hope to cross the distance between them. His posture is relaxed and confident, the body language of someone who knows he holds all the advantages in the confrontation about to unfold. The goblin mask's frozen grin seems to mock Peter's anguish and fear, the painted features somehow more terrifying than any human expression of hatred could be. The villain's voice, when he finally speaks, carries clearly across the distance separating them, pitched to ensure that Peter hears every word of his taunting and every implication of his threats. "Welcome, Spider-Man. I'm so glad you could join us for tonight's entertainment. Your girlfriend and I have been having such a lovely time together, though I must confess she's not much for conversation at the moment. The sedative I used was perhaps a bit stronger than strictly necessary. But better safe than sorry, don't you think? We wouldn't want her waking up and accidentally falling off her perch." Peter's response when he finds his voice is tight with controlled fury and desperate fear. "Let her go, Goblin. Your fight is with me, not with innocent people." "You want to prove you're better than Spider-Man? Fine, face me directly one-on-one and we'll settle this. But leave Gwen out of it. She's done nothing to you, has no part in our conflict." The goblin's laughter echoes across the bridge, harsh and mocking, the sound of madness-given voice. But that's exactly why she's perfect for this, Spider-Man. She represents everything you care about, everything you're trying to protect. By taking her from you, by showing you that all your power and all your heroic posturing can't save the people you love, I demonstrate the ultimate truth. That you're not a hero at all, just a fool in a costume playing at being special, and now you're going to learn what it costs to oppose someone truly superior. The confrontation on the Brooklyn Bridge unfolds with a terrible slowness that makes every second feel like an eternity, as if time itself has been stretched and distorted by the weight of what's happening and the consequences that everyone present knows are coming but cannot prevent. Peter stands on the bridge's main cable, his body coiled with tension, and his mind racing through possibilities and scenarios, each one ending in variations of the same nightmare. The distance between him and Gwen seems impossibly vast, a gulf measured not in feet, but in the terrible space between hope and despair. The Green Goblin circles on his glider with lazy confidence, enjoying the spectacle of Spider-Man's anguish, and using the time to deliver his prepared monologue of victory and vindication. His voice carries the particular quality of madness that believes itself to be sanity, the certainty of someone who has constructed an elaborate justification for actions that any moral person would recognize as monstrous. He speaks not just to taunt Peter, but to explain himself, to make clear the reasoning behind his revenge and the inevitability of the tragedy he has orchestrated. "You've been a thorn in my side for so long, Spider-Man," the Goblin continues, his words flowing with the rehearsed quality of someone who has imagined this conversation many times. "Always interfering with my plans, always playing the hero, always acting as if you're somehow morally superior to those of us who understand that power makes its own rules. But tonight, I'm going to teach you something about the nature of power and the limits of heroism. I'm going to show you that all your strength, all your agility, all your special abilities mean nothing when faced with simple physics and the cruel mathematics of time and distance." Peter's mind works frantically while the Goblin speaks, analysing the situation from every angle and searching for the strategy that will save Gwen without giving the villain any opportunity to carry out his threats. The problem is devastatingly simple in its geometry. Peter is too far away to reach Gwen before the Goblin could push her or knock her from her precarious position on the suspension cable. any attempt to approach her directly will simply trigger the very attack he's trying to prevent. He needs to find a way to distract the goblin, to draw his attention and his aggression away from Gwen long enough to secure her safety. The spider sense that has saved Peter's life so many times provides constant input about the various dangers surrounding him, but the signals are almost overwhelming in their intensity and complexity. The goblin himself radiates threat, his weapons and his madness making him dangerous in multiple ways simultaneously. The precarious positioning of Gwen's unconscious body creates another danger signal, the constant awareness that any sudden movement or disturbance could send her falling. Even the bridge itself, with its complex structure and the wind that buffets the cables, represents potential hazards that Peter must account for in his planning. Peter's voice, when he responds to the goblin's taunting, is carefully controlled to hide the fear and desperation churning beneath the surface. He knows that showing weakness will only encourage his enemy, will feed the goblin's sadistic pleasure in Peter's suffering. "You talk a lot about power and superiority, Goblin, but all I see is a coward who has to threaten innocent people because he can't face me directly. You want to prove you're better than Spider-Man? Let Gwen go, and we'll settle this right now, just you and me. Unless you're afraid that without hostages and elaborate schemes you're nothing but a failed scientist in a Halloween costume." The insult is calculated to provoke the goblin into rash action, to make him angry enough that he might forget his careful plans and attack Peter directly. It's a dangerous gambit because an enraged goblin might hurt Gwen out of spite before turning his attention to Spider-Man, but Peter is running out of options and out of time. Gwen remains unconscious and vulnerable, positioned in a place where Peter cannot quickly reach her. Every second that passes is another second where something could go wrong, where a gust of wind could disturb her balance, or the goblin could decide to end his game and simply drop her. The goblin's reaction to Peter's challenge is not the blind rage that Peter hoped to provoke, but rather a kind of amused condescension that suggests Norman's intelligence remains intact beneath his madness. "Oh, Spider-Man, do you really think I'm fool enough to fall for such obvious manipulation? You want me to abandon my advantages and engage you in the kind of straightforward battle where your youth and reflexes might give you an edge. But I didn't achieve everything I've accomplished by being stupid or impulsive. I make plans, I consider contingencies, and I exploit my enemy's weaknesses with precision and creativity." The goblin's glider shifts position slightly, moving closer to where Gwen lies unconscious. And Peter's entire body tenses with the need to act, to do something to protect her from the monster who holds her life in his hands. But he forces himself to remain still, to not give the goblin the satisfaction of seeing him panic, or the opportunity to use Peter's movement as an excuse to hurt Gwen. The self-control required to maintain this stillness, when every instinct screams at him to rush forward and grab Gwen, is almost more than Peter can bear. "You see, the beautiful thing about this situation," the goblin continues, clearly savouring his explanation, "is that there's no good outcome for you. If you attack me directly, I'll simply push your girlfriend off her perch before you can reach me, and we'll see if even your amazing reflexes are fast enough to catch her before she hits the water. If you try to web her to safety from this distance, the impact of the webbing might knock her loose before it can secure her. And if you do nothing, well, eventually my patience will run out and I'll end this game in the most direct way possible." The truth of the goblin's assessment is what makes it so devastating. Peter can see the logical structure of the trap, can understand how each option available to him carries terrible risks of failure. The villain has created a situation designed specifically to exploit the fundamental mismatch between Peter's human limitations and his superhuman responsibilities. He can move faster and react more quickly than normal people, but he cannot be in two places at once, cannot protect someone who is too far away, while simultaneously defending himself against attack. Peter's training and experience, accumulated through years of fighting dangerous enemies and protecting innocent people, guide his analysis of the tactical situation even as his heart screams with fear for Gwen's safety. He marks the positions of all the players, noting sight lines and distances and the time it would take to traverse the space between them. He assesses the goblin's weapons and likely strategies, trying to predict what the villain will do next and how to counter it. He considers the environmental factors, the wind speed and direction, the structural elements of the bridge that might provide cover or tactical advantages. The plan that forms in Peter's mind is desperate and risky, relying on split-second timing and the hope that his spider sense will provide enough warning to make the necessary adjustments. He needs to provoke the goblin into an attack that will draw him away from Gwen, creating a window of opportunity for Peter to secure her safety. But the attack must be serious enough that the goblin commits fully to it, not just a feint or a probe that allows him to maintain his position near his hostage. Peter needs Norman's madness and hatred focused entirely on Spider-Man, needs the villain to forget about Gwen in his eagerness to destroy his enemy. The verbal provocation that Peter uses to trigger this response is carefully chosen to strike at the goblin's deepest insecurities and resentments. You know what's really pathetic about all this, Norman? You call yourself superior, claim to be some kind of genius, but you're just a sad old man who couldn't earn his son's love through normal means. Harry sees right through you, sees the weakness and the failure underneath all your money and power. That's why you need the goblin formula, why you need the costume and the weapons. Because without them, you're nothing, just another disappointed father who drove his family away through his own inadequacies. The reaction is immediate and explosive, exactly as Peter hoped and feared. The goblin's posture shifts from relaxed confidence to coiled fury, the glider lurching forward as Norman's control wavers under the assault of words that strike at truths he cannot acknowledge or accept. The mocking laughter that had characterized his earlier taunting gives way to a snarl of pure rage, the sound of someone whose carefully constructed self-image has been shattered by an attack he cannot defend against with weapons or strength. "You dare speak to me about failure?" the goblin shrieks, his voice losing its previous controlled mockery and becoming something more raw and unhinged. You, who hide behind a mask and pretend to be a hero while you're really just a frightened child playing dress-up. I'll show you what real power looks like, what happens when someone truly superior stops holding back and decides to destroy you completely. The pumpkin bomb that the goblin hurls towards Spider-Man is thrown with such force and fury that it whistles through the air like a cannonball, the orange sphere trailing sparks and smoke as it arcs across the space between them. Peter's spider sense screams a warning and he moves, leaping from his position on the cable and swinging away from the explosion that turns night into day for a brief, brilliant moment. The concussive force of the blast buffets him even at a distance, threatening to tear him from his webline and send him tumbling toward the river below. But the important thing, the crucial element that makes the risk worthwhile, is that the goblin has moved away from Gwen in his eagerness to attack Peter directly. The glider has shifted position, drawn forward by Norman's fury and his need to see his enemy suffer. The distance between the villain and his hostage has increased by precious feet, creating the opportunity that Peter has been desperately hoping for. Now he just needs to maintain the goblin's focus on him long enough to secure Gwen's safety and turn this from a hostage situation into a straightforward fight. The aerial battle that erupts across the Brooklyn Bridge's span is a deadly dance of movement and counter-movement, as Spider-Man uses every advantage his powers provide to stay ahead of the goblin's attacks, while gradually maneuvering toward Gwen's position. Peter swings on web lines attached to the bridge's cables and towers, using his agility and his spider sense to dodge the barrage of pumpkin bombs and razor bats that the goblin launches at him with mechanical precision. Each near miss reinforces how dangerous his enemy is, how the slightest mistake or moment of inattention could prove fatal. The goblin's flying ability gives him advantages in mobility and angles of attack that Peter must constantly account for in his tactical calculations. The glider allows Norman to change direction suddenly, to climb or dive or hover in ways that ground-based movement cannot match. Peter finds himself fighting not just against an enemy, but against three-dimensional space itself, trying to predict where the goblin will be in the next moment, and position himself to either avoid or counter the attack he knows is coming. The civilians on the bridge below, trapped in their cars or fleeing on foot from the superhuman battle raging above them, provide additional complications that Peter must consider with every move he makes. A wild pumpkin bomb that misses Spider-Man might strike an innocent person, or damage the bridge structure in ways that could cause catastrophic collapse. Peter's responsibility extends beyond just defeating the goblin and saving Gwen to include protecting all the other people whose lives have been put at risk by this confrontation. The psychological dimension of the battle is as important as the physical combat, as the Goblin continues to hurl verbal attacks alongside his explosive weapons, trying to undermine Peter's confidence and concentration. "You're slowing down, Spider-Man. Getting tired already? And here I thought you were supposed to be special, supposed to be a hero. But you're just a boy, aren't you? A scared little boy who watched his uncle die because he was too selfish to help. And now you're going to watch your girlfriend die because you're too weak to save her." The words strike at Peter's deepest wounds and oldest guilts, bringing back memories of Uncle Ben's death and the terrible lesson about responsibility that came too late to save the man who raised him. The Goblin knows about Peter's history, knows the psychological scars that define his heroic mission, and uses that knowledge as a weapon more effective than any explosive device. But Peter has learned through years of experience how to function despite emotional pain, how to channel grief and guilt into focused determination rather than paralyzing despair. The web line that Peter finally manages to shoot toward Gwen, during a brief moment when the Goblin's attention is focused on aiming another pumpkin bomb, represents both hope and terrible new danger. The strand of synthetic polymer attaches to the suspension cable just above where Gwen lies unconscious, creating a connection that Peter can use to swing toward her and secure her safety. But the sudden appearance of the web line immediately alerts the Goblin to what Peter is attempting, triggering the exact response that Peter has been trying to avoid. The Goblin's shriek of fury and his sudden lunge toward Gwen happen almost too fast for even Peter's enhanced reflexes to track and respond to. The glider shoots forward like a missile, closing the distance that Peter's maneuvering had created, reaching for the unconscious woman with hands shaped into claws of malice and rage. Peter sees what's happening and knows with terrible clarity that he's made a mistake, that his attempt to save Gwen has instead triggered the attack he was trying to prevent. The desperate web line that Peter shoots toward the Goblin, hoping to entangle the villain's arms or knock him off course before he can reach Gwen, falls short by inches, the strand passing harmlessly through empty air as the glider's superior speed carries Norman past the point where Peter had aimed. Time seems to slow down as Peter watches his worst nightmare unfold, sees the Goblin's hand reach out and shove Gwen's limp body from its precarious perch on the suspension cable, sending her tumbling toward the water far below. The scream that tears from Peter's throat is raw and primal, the sound of a soul being ripped in half by grief and horror. Everything else, the battle, the Goblin, his own safety, becomes instantly irrelevant compared to the desperate need to reach Gwen before gravity completes its terrible work. He dives off his current web line without thought or planning, simply falling through space in a controlled plummet that matches Gwen's own descent, his hand reaching out toward her with fingers spread wide, as if he could somehow pull her back through sheer force of will and desperate love. The fall happens in a strange stretched moment where time loses its normal meaning, and every fraction of a second becomes distinct and separate, allowing Peter's mind to process details and make observations even as his body hurtles through space in pursuit of the woman he loves. He sees the way Gwen's golden hair streams upward as she falls, creating a halo effect that seems cruelly beautiful given the horror of what's happening. He sees the peaceful expression on her unconscious face, unaware of the danger she's in or the desperate race against physics that will determine whether she lives or dies. He sees the dark water of the East River far below, growing larger and more distinct with each passing instant. Peter's mind, even in the midst of panic and desperate fear, continues to calculate distances and velocities with the automatic precision that years of web-slinging has trained into his reflexes. Gwen is falling at an accelerating rate, pulled by gravity toward the water below. Peter is falling faster, having launched himself downward with additional force to match and exceed her descent rate. The gap between them is closing, measured in feet and then in inches, but the question that tortures him is whether he can reach her in time to make a difference, whether he can deploy his web line and arrest her fall before the impact with the water kills her. The physics of the situation are brutally unforgiving, governed by equations that care nothing for love or heroism or desperate need. A human body falling from the height of the Brooklyn Bridge will reach terminal velocity well before striking the water, accelerating to speeds where the impact with the surface is equivalent to hitting concrete. Gwen's smaller mass and lighter weight mean she accelerates slightly more slowly than Peter, giving him the precious seconds he needs to close the distance between them. But those same factors also mean that she's more fragile, more vulnerable to the forces that will be involved in any attempt to stop her fall. The choice that Peter faces in this terrible moment is one that he will replay in his mind for the rest of his life, analysing every detail and questioning every decision with the kind of obsessive self-examination that becomes its own form of torture. He can attempt to catch Gwen directly, using his enhanced strength and reflexes to grab her body and arrest both their falls with a web line attached to the bridge. Or he can try to web her from a distance, shooting a strand that will attach to her body and allow him to stop her descent without the impact of direct contact. Each option carries its own risks and terrible possibilities for failure. The decision is made in the space between heartbeats, guided by instinct and training rather than by conscious analysis. Peter's hand moves almost of its own accord, his web shooter activating and sending a thick strand of synthetic polymer shooting toward Gwen's falling form. The aim is perfect, the result of countless hours of practice and the enhanced hand-eye coordination that the radioactive spider's bite gave him. The web line strikes Gwen's leg just above the ankle, wrapping around it with the adhesive strength that can support tons of weight and hold fast against forces that would tear steel apart. The other end of the web line attaches to the underside of the bridge's roadway, creating a connection between the falling woman and the massive structure above. For a fraction of a second, hope blooms in Peter's chest, the belief that he's done it, that he's saved her, that his quick thinking and superhuman abilities have once again proven sufficient to protect the people he loves from the dangers that surround them. But physics, cruel and indifferent, has other plans. The force required to stop a falling human body is tremendous, a function of mass and velocity that increases exponentially with the distance of the fall. Gwen has been falling for several seconds, long enough to build up significant downward momentum. When the web line reaches its full extension and begins to arrest her descent, the deceleration is sudden and violent, creating forces that the human body was never designed to withstand. The web line holds perfectly, strong enough to support many times Gwen's weight. The attachment to her ankle remains secure, the adhesive grip unbreakable. But the connection between Gwen's head and her neck, the delicate structure of bone and tissue that allows for the movement and flexibility necessary for life, cannot withstand the whiplash effect of her body being brought to a sudden stop while her head continues to move with the momentum of the fall. The sound that reaches Peter's ears as he swings down toward where Gwen now hangs, suspended from his web line, is small and terrible, a crack that seems impossibly loud in the sudden silence following the chaos of the battle. It's a sound that he will hear again in nightmares for the rest of his life, in quiet moments when his mind wanders and in the space between waking and sleep. It's the sound of everything changing, of the moment when hope transforms into despair and heroism reveals its terrible limitations. Peter reaches Gwen within seconds of hearing that sound, his hands gentle as they cradle her body and support her weight, careful not to cause any additional injury even as part of his mind understands that no amount of care can matter now. He pulls her close, one arm around her waist and the other supporting her head. And only then does he allow himself to truly look at her, to see what his rescue attempt has done. Her face is still peaceful, still wearing the unconscious serenity that the goblin's sedative gave her. There's no sign of pain or fear in her expression, nothing to suggest that she experienced even a moment of suffering or awareness of what was happening to her. But the angle of her head against his shoulder is wrong, tilted in a way that speaks of fundamental damage to the structures that should hold it in place. Peter's enhanced senses, which allow him to detect heartbeats and breathing from across a room, tell him what his heart refuses to accept, that there's no pulse beating in her throat, no breath moving in her lungs, no life remaining in the body he holds so carefully in his arms. The grief that floods through Peter in this moment is beyond anything he has words to describe, a pain so intense and all-consuming that it threatens to tear his mind apart with its magnitude. This is the woman he loves, the person who represented his hope for a future that included happiness and normalcy, alongside heroic responsibility. This is Gwen, whose smile could light up a room and whose kindness made everyone around her feel valued and understood. This is the golden girl who saw past his awkwardness and his secrets to the good heart underneath, who loved him despite all the complications and dangers that came with being Spider-Man's girlfriend. And she's gone. Not wounded or endangered or in need of rescue, but simply gone. Her life ended in the instant when his webline did exactly what it was designed to do, stopping her fall with perfect efficiency and terrible consequence. Peter's mind races through alternate possibilities, scenarios where he made different choices and achieved different outcomes. If he had caught her directly instead of using a webline, if he had positioned himself differently, if he had been faster or slower or more careful, would she still be alive? The questions torture him even as he knows they're pointless, that the past cannot be changed no matter how desperately he wishes he could go back and make different choices. The sound of the Green Goblin's laughter breaks through Peter's grief-stricken paralysis, reminding him that the villain is still present, still hovering nearby on his glider to observe the results of his revenge. The laughter is not the manic cackling of earlier, but something more satisfied and cruel. The sound of someone who has achieved exactly what he set out to accomplish and is savouring the fruits of his victory. Norman's voice, when he speaks, carries a note of almost academic interest, as if he's observing a particularly interesting experiment rather than gloating over a murder. Well, well, Spider-Man. It seems your vaunted powers weren't quite enough after all. You tried so hard to save her, moved so fast, aimed so perfectly, and yet here we are, with your girlfriend dead and you holding her corpse. I wonder, did you feel it when she died? Did you sense the exact moment when your rescue became her execution? Because from where I'm standing, it looked like your webline is what killed her. The fall might have done the job eventually, but you're the one who actually broke her neck. How does that feel, hero? The rage that rises in Peter's chest is unlike anything he has ever experienced. A fury so pure and intense that it burns away everything else. All the grief and guilt and self-recrimination consumed in the white-hot fire of his need to make the goblin pay for what he's done. Peter's mind, which has always been his greatest asset alongside his spider powers, recognizes that this rage is dangerous, that fighting while consumed by emotion rather than guided by tactical thinking is likely to lead to mistakes and missed opportunities. But in this moment, he doesn't care about tactical thinking or careful planning. He cares only about destruction, about using every ounce of his strength to hurt the monster who murdered the woman he loves. The webline that Peter uses to secure Gwen's body to the bridge's structure is placed with infinite care, ensuring that she's safe and stable, even though part of his mind acknowledges the bitter irony of worrying about her safety now. He positions her gently on the bridge's pedestrian walkway, arranging her body with the tenderness that one might use with a sleeping child, unable to accept the finality of her death or the fact that no amount of care will make any difference now. His hands linger on her face for a moment, tracing the familiar contours and committing every detail to memory, before he forces himself to turn away and face the monster who has taken her from him. The transformation that has occurred in Peter during these few terrible minutes is visible in his body language and his movement patterns. The playful, acrobatic fighting style that has characterized his career as Spider-Man, the wisecracking and light-hearted approach that made even serious battles seem less grim, has been replaced by something darker and more focused. He moves now with deadly intent, each gesture economical and purposeful, conserved energy directed toward the single goal of making the Green Goblin suffer for what he's done. The Green Goblin, watching Spider-Man's approach, experiences a moment of uncertainty that cuts through his triumphant satisfaction. He has faced Spider-Man many times, has learned to read the hero's movements and predict his strategies. But the figure now swinging toward him with such terrible purpose is someone different, someone whose restraint and mercy have been burned away by grief and replaced with something that looks very much like the Goblin's own capacity for violence and destruction. For the first time in this encounter, Norman feels the stirring of something that might be fear. The battle that erupts between Spider-Man and the Green Goblin in the wake of Gwen's death is savage and relentless, stripped of the psychological warfare and taunting that characterized their earlier confrontation. Peter attacks with a fury that surprises even his enemy. His enhanced strength no longer carefully modulated to avoid causing permanent injury, but instead unleashed with the full intent to harm. The blows he lands carry enough force to dent the goblin's armor and drive the air from Norman's lungs, each strike accompanied by memories of Gwen's smile, her laugh, her kindness. Everything that has been taken from the world by this madman's revenge. The goblin's attempts to maintain distance and use his aerial mobility to offset Spider-Man's superior agility prove less effective than usual, as Peter's grief-fueled rage seems to give him even faster reflexes and more precise aim. Web lines snag the glider's controls and interfere with its maneuvering, pulling the goblin into range of Spider-Man's fists and feet. Pumpkin bombs are dodged or batted away before they can detonate, their explosions lighting up the night sky but failing to slow Spider-Man's relentless assault. The fear that the goblin experiences as the battle turns against him is a new and unwelcome sensation, cutting through the madness and artificial confidence that the goblin formula provides. He has always believed himself superior to Spider-Man, has always trusted that his intelligence and his willingness to cross moral lines that heroes won't approach would give him ultimate victory. But the hero who now presses him so hard, who seems immune to pain and driven by something beyond mere duty or responsibility, is not someone the goblin knows how to fight or manipulate. The moment when Peter's fist connects with the goblin's jaw, with enough force to crack the protective mask and send Norman reeling backwards on his glider, is accompanied by a terrible temptation, a desire to simply keep hitting until the monster who killed Gwen is as dead as she is, until justice and revenge become the same thing. Peter's hand draws back for another blow, one that he knows could be fatal given the force he's capable of generating and the vulnerable position of his enemy. The choice before him is stark and simple, to kill or to show the mercy that defines the difference between hero and murderer. The choice that Peter faces in this moment, with his fist drawn back and the power to end Norman Osborn's life literally in his hands, represents the ultimate test of everything Uncle Ben tried to teach him about responsibility and the difference between justice and vengeance. Every fibre of his being screams for blood, for the satisfaction of watching the life fade from the eyes of the man who murdered Gwen. The rage burning in his chest demands release, demands that he use his power to punish the guilty in the most final way possible. But somewhere beneath the fury and the grief, a small voice reminds him of who he is and what he has always tried to be. The memory of Uncle Ben's death and the lessons that followed provides context for Peter's struggle with his darker impulses. He learned then that allowing criminals to escape or refusing to take responsibility for stopping them has consequences that can destroy innocent lives. But he also learned, in the years since, that becoming like the people he fights, embracing their willingness to kill and their disregard for human life, represents a different kind of failure, one that would dishonour Uncle Ben's memory and betray everything that Spider-Man is supposed to stand for. Gwen's own voice seems to speak in Peter's memory, reminding him of conversations they had about justice and mercy, about the importance of maintaining moral principles even when they're difficult or painful. She believed in the rule of law, in the idea that civilization depends on people choosing restraint over revenge and trusting systems of justice to handle punishment for wrongdoing. She would not want her death to transform Peter into a killer, would not want her memory to be associated with the moment when Spider-Man crossed the line from hero to murderer. The physical effort required to lower his fist and step back from the helpless goblin is immense, requiring Peter to overcome the momentum of his rage and the terrible simplicity of the solution that violence offers. His entire body shakes with the tension between what he wants to do and what he knows he should do, between the person his grief is trying to make him become and the person Uncle Ben and Gwen would want him to be. The breath that escapes his lips is ragged and harsh, carrying with it some small portion of the fury that threatens to consume him. Norman Osborn, dazed and bleeding behind his cracked mask, experiences a moment of genuine terror as he looks into Spider-Man's eyes and sees death waiting there. He understands in this instant that he has pushed too far, that his revenge has created something far more dangerous than the hero he thought he knew. The goblin persona that has sustained him throughout this encounter, providing artificial courage and manic confidence, suddenly feels inadequate to the situation he has created. He has awakened something in Spider-Man that even he, with all his madness and malice, finds frightening. Peter's voice, when he finally speaks, is rough with emotion and terrible restraint, each word forced through the constriction in his throat. You want to know why you lost tonight, Goblin? It's not because I'm stronger or faster or more powerful than you. It's because even now, even after what you've done, I won't become what you are. I won't let your evil turn me into a killer. Gwen deserves better than that. Uncle Ben deserves better than that. And somewhere deep down, beneath all the hate and madness, maybe even you deserve better than that. The words carry weight beyond their immediate meaning, representing Peter's conscious choice to maintain his moral identity despite the overwhelming temptation to abandon it. By articulating his refusal to kill, by making it a spoken commitment rather than just an internal decision, he reinforces his determination to remain true to his principles. The act of speaking the words aloud makes them more real, more binding, creating a promise to himself and to the memory of the people he has loved and lost. The Green Goblin's response, when he recovers enough to speak, carries a note of confusion and almost disappointment, as if Peter's mercy is somehow more disturbing than his rage would have been. You're a fool, Spider-Man. I killed your girlfriend, destroyed your future, and you're still going to let me live? What kind of hero spares the monster who took everything from him? You could end this right now, make sure I never hurt anyone else, and instead you're going to web me up and hand me over to the police so I can escape and do this all over again. The truth in the Goblin's words creates a fresh wave of pain in Peter's chest. Because he knows that Norman is right about the practical consequences of mercy. The criminal justice system is imperfect, prisons have weaknesses, and determined villains often find ways to escape and return to their evil activities. By choosing not to kill the Goblin, Peter accepts the risk that Norman might indeed hurt more innocent people in the future, might claim more victims in his ongoing war against Spider-Man and everything the hero represents. But accepting that risk is part of what it means to be a hero rather than an executioner, to trust in systems and institutions rather than in personal power. The web cocoon that Peter wraps around the defeated Goblin is thorough and efficient, layers of synthetic polymer that will hold even Norman's enhanced strength until the police arrive to take him into custody. Peter works with mechanical precision, his hands moving through the familiar motions while his mind remains partially disconnected from what he's doing. Part of his consciousness is still back on the bridge's walkway where Gwen's body lies, still caught in the terrible moment when the web line snapped taut and everything changed forever. The approach of police sirens provides a kind of deadline, a reminder that Peter needs to leave the scene before he's forced to explain his presence or answer questions about what happened here tonight. The last thing he can handle right now is an interrogation or the need to maintain his secret identity in the face of official scrutiny. He needs to take Gwen somewhere safe, somewhere he can be alone with her and begin the impossible process of accepting that she's gone. The decision about what to do with Gwen's body is agonizing in its necessity and its finality. Peter cannot simply leave her here for the police to find, cannot allow her to be treated as evidence in a crime scene or subjected to the cold impersonality of official procedures. But taking her away means accepting responsibility for explaining her death to her father, means facing Captain Stacy and admitting that Spider-Man failed to protect the person who mattered most to him in all the world. The web hammock that Peter constructs to carry Gwen is gentle and supportive, cradling her body with the same care he might use for a living person. He positions her carefully, ensuring that her head is supported and her limbs are arranged with dignity, unable to stop treating her with the tenderness that love demands, even though the rational part of his mind knows it doesn't matter anymore. The act of lifting her in his arms and beginning the journey away from the bridge feels like a kind of theft, as if he's stealing these final moments with her before the world takes her away completely. The flight across the city toward the Stacy home is the longest journey Peter has ever made, each swing of his web lines weighted with grief and dread. He holds Gwen close against his chest, feeling the absence of warmth in her body and the terrible stillness that speaks of life departed. The city passes beneath them in a blur of lights and shadows, the normal activity of a Tuesday night continuing despite the fact that Peter's entire world has ended. People walk dogs, hail taxis, laugh with friends, completely unaware that something precious and irreplaceable has been lost. The landing on the roof of the Stacy apartment building is soft and careful, Peter's enhanced agility allowing him to touch down without jarring the burden he carries. He stands for a long moment in the darkness, gathering his courage and trying to find words for what he needs to say to Captain Stacy. How do you tell a father that his daughter is dead? How do you explain that you tried to save her but failed, that your powers and your quick thinking weren't enough to prevent tragedy? How do you ask forgiveness for failing to protect someone who trusted you with her safety? The knock on Captain Stacy's door is gentle but firm, Peter's knuckles rapping against the wood with a sound that seems impossibly loud in the quiet hallway. He stands in the shadows, still wearing his Spider-Man costume but holding Gwen's body in a way that makes his identity temporarily irrelevant. When the door opens and Captain Stacy's face appears, showing first confusion and then growing horror as he recognizes what Spider-Man is carrying, Peter finds that all his prepared words have fled and he can only stand there, mute with grief, offering the terrible gift of his daughter's body. Captain Stacy's reaction is complex and devastating to witness, a progression from shock to denial to reluctant acceptance that plays across his face in the space of a few heartbeats. He reaches out with trembling hands to touch Gwen's face, perhaps hoping to find some sign that this is a mistake, that she's merely unconscious or injured rather than dead. When his fingers encounter the coldness of her skin and the unnatural angle of her neck, something breaks inside him and he makes a sound that Peter will never forget, a father's grief given voice in a way that transcends language. The explanation that Peter offers, his voice cracking with emotion and guilt, provides the basic facts of what happened without dwelling on the terrible details. The Green Goblin kidnapped her, used her as bait to lure Spider-Man into a confrontation, pushed her from the bridge when the battle turned against him. Spider-Man tried to save her, shot a web line to catch her fall, but the sudden stop broke her neck. She died instantly, never woke from the sedative the Goblin had given her, experienced no pain or fear. The words feel inadequate and hollow, unable to capture the magnitude of the loss or the complexity of what happened on that bridge. Captain Stacy's response after the initial wave of grief has passed shows the character and wisdom that made him one of the few police officers who truly understood and supported Spider-Man's mission. He doesn't blame the masked hero for Gwen's death, doesn't give voice to the accusations and recriminations that would be understandable under the circumstances. Instead, he recognizes that Spider-Man tried to save his daughter, that the villain who kidnapped her bears the true responsibility for what happened, and that sometimes tragedy strikes despite everyone's best efforts to prevent it. The conversation between Spider-Man and Captain Stacy in that doorway, conducted in low voices while Gwen's body rests between them, becomes a kind of mutual support session where two men who love the same woman try to make sense of senseless loss. Captain Stacy shares memories of Gwen's childhood, stories of her kindness and her intelligence, and the joy she brought to everyone who knew her. Peter listens through his mask, grateful for these glimpses of the parts of Gwen's life that he never got to witness, the years before he knew her when she was forming into the remarkable person he fell in love with. The moment when Captain Stacy invites Spider-Man to come inside to remove his mask and share his grief as Peter Parker, rather than as a costumed hero, represents a pivotal choice about identity and trust. Peter understands that accepting this invitation means revealing his secret to someone outside his immediate family, means acknowledging publicly for the first time that Peter Parker and Spider-Man are the same person. But the need for genuine human connection in this moment of overwhelming loss outweighs his usual caution about protecting his identity. The removal of the mask in Captain Stacy's living room. With Gwen's body laid out carefully on the couch and covered with a blanket that her father provides, feels like shedding a skin that has become too tight and constraining. Peter's face, revealed to Captain Stacy for the first time, is wet with tears and twisted with grief, showing the human vulnerability that the mask usually conceals. The older man's lack of surprise at seeing Peter's features suggests that he had already deduced or suspected the truth, that his detective skills and his observations of the relationship between his daughter and the young man who was always mysteriously absent when Spider-Man appeared had led him to the correct conclusion. The embrace that Captain Stacy offers Peter is paternal and comforting, providing the kind of physical human contact that Peter desperately needs but hasn't allowed himself to seek. The two men stand together in the quiet apartment, holding each other while Gwen's body lies nearby, sharing grief that finds no adequate expression in words. Peter cries against the older man's shoulder, great racking sobs that shake his entire frame, releasing some portion of the anguish that threatens to tear him apart. Captain Stacy cries too, his tears soaking into Peter's hair, the strong police captain momentarily reduced to simply a father who has lost his child. The hours that follow in Captain Stacy's apartment pass in a kind of suspended reality, where time seems to have lost its normal forward progression, and instead simply exists as a space for grief to expand and fill. Peter and Captain Stacy sit together in the living room, sometimes talking in quiet voices about Gwen and the light she brought into their lives, sometimes simply sitting in silence with their thoughts and their memories. The presence of her body, resting peacefully on the couch as if she might wake at any moment, creates a strange combination of comfort and unbearable pain, a physical reminder of both who she was and who she will never be again. The practical arrangements that must be made following a death begin to intrude on their grief as the night wears on, and Captain Stacy recognizes that he needs to contact the coroner's office and begin the official procedures that will transform his daughter from a person into a case file. Peter offers to leave, to give the captain privacy for these difficult tasks, but the older man asks him to stay, expressing a need for the companionship of someone who loved Gwen as deeply as he did. The bond forming between them in these dark hours is built on shared loss and mutual understanding, creating a connection that will endure long after this terrible night has ended. The phone call that Captain Stacy makes to the medical examiner is brief and professional, his police training allowing him to maintain composure while reporting his daughter's death and requesting that someone be sent to collect her body. He provides the basic facts without elaboration, stating that she died as the result of a criminal attack and that the perpetrator has been apprehended by Spider-Man and turned over to police custody. The official tone he uses creates a kind of emotional distance that allows him to function despite his grief, compartmentalizing his role as father and his role as officer of the law. Peter listens to this conversation with a mixture of admiration and sorrow, recognizing the strength required to maintain professionalism under such circumstances while also feeling the terrible wrongness of Gwen being reduced to official language and bureaucratic procedures. She was so much more than a victim or a case number, so much more than the dry facts that will appear in police reports and death certificates. She was warmth and intelligence and kindness. A whole person with dreams and fears and the capacity to make everyone around her feel valued and understood. The arrival of the medical examiner's team, announced by a quiet knock on the door, marks the beginning of the process that will take Gwen away from them and begin the transformation of her death from a private grief into a public event. Captain Stacy requests a few more minutes alone with his daughter before allowing the officials to enter, and Peter understands that this is his signal to leave, to slip away before his presence complicates the official investigation or raises questions about Spider-Man's involvement in the night's events. The goodbye that Peter says to Gwen before he goes is whispered and private, a final moment alone with her body while Captain Stacy speaks quietly with the officials in the hallway. Peter kneels beside the couch where she lies, his hand finding hers beneath the blanket and holding it gently, feeling the coldness of her fingers and remembering how they used to intertwine with his own when they walked together through the city. The words he speaks are simple and heartfelt, promises that he will never forget her, that he will honor her memory by continuing to fight for the kind of world she believed in, that her death will not be meaningless if he can prevent others from suffering similar fates. The window through which Peter exits Captain Stacy's apartment opens onto a fire escape that leads to the roof, providing him with a discreet exit route that avoids the officials gathered in the hallway. He pauses at the window to look back one final time at Gwen's covered form, committing the scene to memory even though he knows it will haunt him for the rest of his life. Then he pulls his mask back over his face, hiding Peter Parker's grief behind Spider-Man's expressionless features, and climbs out into the cool night air. The city that greets Peter as he emerges onto the rooftop looks different than it did just hours earlier, transformed by loss into something less welcoming and more hostile. The lights that earlier seemed beautiful now appear cold and indifferent, illuminating a world that continues its normal routines despite the fact that someone precious has been lost. The sounds of traffic and distant sirens and the general hum of urban life create a soundtrack that feels inappropriate to the magnitude of what has happened, as if the city should have paused in its activities to acknowledge Gwen's passing. Peter's journey from Captain Stacy's building to his own apartment in Queens takes him across familiar territory that now seems alien and strange, filtered through the lens of his grief and exhaustion. He swings mechanically from building to building, his body moving through the practiced motions while his mind remains partially disconnected, still processing the events of the night and struggling to accept their reality. The physical exertion provides no relief from his emotional pain, no distraction from the memories that play on endless repeat in his thoughts. The apartment that Peter shares with Harry Osborn is dark when he arrives, suggesting that his roommate is either out or already asleep. Peter is grateful for this small mercy, for the opportunity to be alone with his grief rather than forced to maintain a facade of normalcy, while Harry asks cheerful questions about his evening. The thought of Harry, blissfully unaware that his father murdered Peter's girlfriend tonight, creates a fresh wave of complicated emotions that Peter doesn't have the energy to process right now. The shower that Peter stands under for nearly an hour, letting the hot water beat against his shoulders and mix with his tears, provides a kind of physical purification that unfortunately cannot cleanse the guilt and grief from his soul. He scrubs at his skin as if trying to wash away the memory of what happened, but the images remain vivid and terrible in his mind. Gwen falling, the webline catching her ankle, the terrible sound of her neck breaking. The weight of her lifeless body in his arms. No amount of water can erase these memories or provide escape from their constant replay. The face that looks back at Peter from the bathroom mirror when he finally emerges from the shower is haggard and hollow-eyed, belonging to someone who has aged years in a single night. The physical manifestations of his grief are evident in the dark circles under his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the tightness around his mouth that speaks of pain held barely in check. He looks like someone who has been broken and is holding the pieces together through sheer force of will, which is essentially what he is. The bed that Peter collapses into offers no real rest, despite his exhaustion, as sleep brings nightmares that replay the events on the bridge with terrible variations and alternative outcomes. In some dreams he catches Gwen successfully, and they embrace on the bridge, laughing with relief. In others he misses entirely and she hits the water with fatal impact. In the worst versions he catches her, but she dies anyway, her eyes opening to look at him with accusation and betrayal, before the light fades from them. He wakes repeatedly throughout the night, gasping and disoriented, the boundary between nightmare and memory blurred beyond recognition. The dawn that eventually breaks through Peter's bedroom window finds him exhausted but unable to sleep, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling while his mind continues its obsessive analysis of everything he did wrong. The what-ifs and if-onlys multiply with each passing hour, creating an endless series of alternative scenarios where different choices lead to different outcomes. If he had been faster, if he had aimed differently, if he had caught her directly instead of using a web line, if he had never let the goblin draw him into conversation instead of acting immediately, would Gwen still be alive? The rational part of Peter's mind understands that this kind of second-guessing is pointless and destructive, that dwelling on what might have been cannot change what actually happened. But grief is not rational, and guilt does not respond to logic or reason. The weight of responsibility that Uncle Ben taught him to embrace now feels crushing rather than motivating. A burden too heavy to carry because it includes accountability for failures and losses that no amount of power or good intentions could prevent. The sound of Harry moving around in the apartment, apparently having returned while Peter was lost in his nightmares, creates a new source of stress and anxiety. How does Peter face his best friend knowing that Harry's father murdered Peter's girlfriend just hours earlier? How does he maintain the pretense of normalcy when everything has changed in fundamental ways? How does he look Harry in the eyes without seeing the Green Goblin's features beneath his friend's face? The knock on Peter's bedroom door is tentative and concerned. Harry's voice calling out to ask if Peter is okay and whether he wants breakfast. The normalcy of the question, the everyday domestic routine it represents, feels jarring and inappropriate given the magnitude of what happened last night. But Peter recognizes that Harry doesn't know about Gwen's death yet, hasn't heard the news that will soon be spreading through their social circle and across the city. For Harry, this is just another morning, and Peter needs to behave accordingly until he can find a way to break the terrible news. The conversation that takes place when Peter emerges from his room, trying to appear normal despite his red eyes and obvious exhaustion, is awkward and stilted. Harry notices immediately that something is wrong, but attributes it to a bad night's sleep or perhaps a fight with Gwen. Peter allows this misinterpretation to stand rather than revealing the truth, not yet ready to speak the words that will make Gwen's death real in this context. The coffee that Harry offers tastes like ashes in Peter's mouth, but he drinks it anyway, going through the motions of ordinary life because he doesn't know what else to do. The news of Gwen's death breaks publicly later that morning, appearing first as reports of a kidnapping and confrontation on the Brooklyn Bridge that resulted in one fatality. The initial coverage focuses on the dramatic battle between Spider-Man and the Green Goblin, treating Gwen's death almost as a side note to the larger story of superhuman conflict. Peter watches the news coverage with Harry, both of them sitting frozen in front of the television as the reporter describes the events of the previous night and confirms that Gwen Stacy, daughter of Police Captain George Stacy, died during the incident. Harry's reaction to the news is shock and disbelief, his face going pale as he processes the information and tries to reconcile it with his memories of seeing Gwen just days earlier, vibrant and alive and making plans for the future. He turns to Peter with questions in his eyes, looking for confirmation or denial, and Peter can only nod mutely, unable to trust his voice to remain steady if he tries to speak. The two friends sit together in stunned silence. United in their grief for someone they both cared about deeply, the revelation that follows, delivered by the news anchor with the kind of dramatic flair that makes Peter want to put his fist through the television screen, adds another layer of horror to the situation. The Green Goblin has been identified as Norman Osborn, prominent industrialist and father of Harry Osborn, who is currently in police custody and facing charges of murder, kidnapping, and various other felonies related to his activities as a costume criminal. The camera shows footage of Norman being led into the police station, still wearing portions of his goblin costume and looking wild-eyed and dishevelled. Harry's response to learning that his father is the Green Goblin and is responsible for Gwen's death is a kind of total psychological collapse that Peter watches with helpless sympathy. All the pieces suddenly fall into place for Harry. All the mysterious absences and strange behaviours, all the times his father seemed different or acted in ways that didn't match his public persona. The knowledge that the man who raised him, who he has spent his whole life trying to please and impress, is a murderer and a monster proves too much for Harry's already fragile mental state to process. Peter's attempt to comfort his friend is complicated by his own grief and by the complex tangle of emotions he feels toward Norman Osborn. Part of him wants to rage at Harry about what his father did, to make Harry somehow pay for the sins of his parent, but the larger, better part of Peter recognises that Harry is as much a victim in this situation as anyone else, that learning your father is a killer who murdered your friend must be its own special kind of hell. The embrace that Peter offers Harry is genuine and heartfelt, two young men clinging to each other while their world falls apart around them. The days that follow Gwen's death blur together in Peter's memory, a succession of difficult moments and painful obligations that he navigates with numb determination. There are interviews with police detectives who want to understand exactly what happened on the bridge and whether Spider-Man bears any responsibility for Gwen's death. There are reporters seeking comment on the tragedy, and photographers trying to capture images of Peter's grief for publication in tomorrow's papers. There are well-meaning friends and acquaintances offering condolences and support that somehow make everything worse rather than better. The funeral planning becomes Captain Stacy's responsibility, as Gwen's mother is too overcome with grief to manage the practical arrangements. Peter offers to help in whatever way he can, but the captain gently suggests that Peter focus on taking care of himself and preparing for the emotional ordeal of the funeral service. The knowledge that he will soon have to say goodbye to Gwen in front of everyone they know, that her death will become a public event witnessed by hundreds of mourners, fills Peter with dread that sits heavy in his stomach. The media coverage of Gwen's death evolves over the following days from straightforward reporting to more sensationalized stories about the dangers of superhero conflicts and the innocent bystanders who get caught in the crossfire. J. Jonah Jameson predictably uses the tragedy as evidence for his long-standing argument that vigilantes like Spider-Man do more harm than good, running editorials that strongly imply the wall-crawler bears responsibility for Gwen's death. Peter reads these accusations with bitter resignation, recognizing that in some terrible way, Jameson is not entirely wrong. The question of responsibility weighs on Peter with crushing intensity during the days between Gwen's death and her funeral, growing heavier with each newspaper article and television report that analyses the tragedy from every possible angle. The city seems divided in its judgment of Spider-Man's role in what happened, with some voices defending the hero's attempts to save an innocent victim and others condemning his involvement as the catalyst that led to her death. Peter reads and watches all of it, subjecting himself to every opinion and critique as a form of self-punishment, believing that he deserves to hear the worst things people can say about his failure. The legal proceedings surrounding Norman Osborn's arrest add another dimension to the public discourse about the events on the Brooklyn Bridge. The district attorney's office announces that they will be seeking murder charges against Osborn for Gwen's death, arguing that her kidnapping and the circumstances that led to her fall constitute premeditated homicide regardless of the specific mechanism that caused her death. The case attracts intense media attention, not just because of the prominent defendant, but because it raises complex questions about criminal responsibility when multiple actors contribute to a fatal outcome. Norman's defense attorneys, expensive specialists in criminal law who are among the best that money can buy, begin constructing arguments that attempt to shift blame away from their client and towards Spider-Man. They argue that Gwen Stacy died not from any action Norman Osborn took, but from Spider-Man's misguided rescue attempt, that if the masked vigilante had simply allowed the police to handle the situation through negotiation and proper tactical procedures, the young woman would still be alive. The cynicism and calculated nature of this defense strategy makes Peter physically ill when he hears about it, but he recognizes the terrible kernel of truth buried within the lies and misdirection. The psychiatric evaluation that the court orders for Norman, attempting to determine his competency to stand trial and his mental state at the time of the crime, reveals the complex relationship between Norman Osborn the businessman and the Green Goblin persona created by chemical enhancement and psychological breakdown. The doctors describe a dissociative condition where Norman genuinely seems to have limited awareness of and control over the actions taken by his goblin identity, raising uncomfortable questions about criminal responsibility and the nature of free will when brain chemistry has been fundamentally altered. Peter's testimony to the district attorney's office, given in a closed session to protect his identity as Spider-Man, provides the prosecution with detailed information about Norman's history as the Green Goblin and his deliberate choice to kidnap Gwen as part of a revenge scheme against Spider-Man. Peter describes the planning and premeditation evident in Norman's actions, the way he used Gwen as bait and positioned her in a location specifically chosen to create maximum danger. The recounting of these events forces Peter to relive the night on the bridge in excruciating detail, opening wounds that have barely begun to form the thinnest protective scabs. The question that the prosecutors inevitably ask, delivered with professional delicacy but cutting straight to Peter's deepest guilt, concerns his decision to use a web line to catch Gwen rather than attempting to grab her directly. Could he explain his tactical reasoning in that moment? Did he consider alternative approaches? Does he believe a different choice might have resulted in a different outcome? Peter answers honestly, describing the split-second decision-making process and the factors he considered, but his voice breaks when he admits that yes, he has thought of nothing but alternative approaches since that night, and yes, he believes there might have been better choices he could have made. The support that Peter receives from Aunt May during this terrible period is unwavering and essential to his ability to continue functioning. She knows nothing of his secret identity as Spider-Man, understands the situation only through the distorted lens of news coverage and second-hand information, but she recognizes that her nephew is suffering in ways that go beyond normal grief. She provides what comfort she can through home-cooked meals, quiet companionship, and the simple reassurance of her presence, asking no questions that Peter isn't ready to answer, and offering no platitudes that would minimize the magnitude of his loss. The conversation that Peter finally has with Aunt May about Gwen, sitting together in the kitchen of their Queen's home while rain patters against the windows, provides him with an opportunity to speak about the woman he loved without the complications of his secret identity entering the discussion. He describes Gwen's kindness and intelligence, her dreams for the future, and the way she made everyone around her feel valued and understood. He talks about their plans together, the life they thought they would build, and how empty the world feels now that she's gone. Aunt May listens with patient sympathy. her own memories of loss and grief informing her understanding of what Peter is experiencing. The wisdom that Aunt May offers, drawn from her decades of life experience and her own journey through grief after Uncle Ben's death, focuses not on trying to make sense of senseless tragedy, but on finding ways to continue living despite the weight of loss. She tells Peter that grief is not something you get over or move past, but rather something you learn to carry, that the pain of losing someone you love never completely disappears, but it does gradually become more bearable. She reminds him that Gwen would want him to find happiness again eventually, would not want her death to define the rest of his life, or prevent him from opening his heart to love in the future. The guilt that Peter carries about his role in Gwen's death is something he cannot fully share with Aunt May, because explaining why he feels responsible would require revealing his identity as Spider-Man and the specific circumstances of what happened on the bridge. This enforced silence creates a kind of isolation within their conversation, a barrier between them that prevents complete honesty and mutual understanding. Peter wants desperately to tell her everything, to confess his secret and his guilt, and to hear her tell him that he's not the terrible person he believes himself to be. But the words won't come, trapped behind the wall of secrecy that has defined his life since the spider bite changed everything. The relationship between Peter and Harry continues to deteriorate during this period, strained by their shared grief and by the complicated feelings that Norman's actions have created. Harry is dealing not only with the loss of Gwen, but also with the destruction of his relationship with his father, and the revelation that the man who raised him is a murderer. The combination proves too much for Harry's already fragile psychological state, and he begins drinking more heavily and withdrawing from his friends and responsibilities. Peter wants to help, but finds himself unable to reach his friend through the walls of grief and shame that Harry has constructed around himself. The nightmare that Harry is living, discovering that his father killed his friend and that everything he thought he knew about Norman Osborn was a carefully maintained lie, creates a kind of identity crisis that manifests in increasingly self-destructive behaviour. He stops attending classes, neglects his personal hygiene and his health, and spends long hours sitting alone in his room staring at photographs of his father and trying to reconcile the man he knew with the monster he has become. Peter's attempts to intervene are met with hostility and resistance, as Harry seems to interpret any offer of help as pity or judgment. The memorial service that Empire State University holds for Gwen, separate from the private funeral that her family is planning, provides Peter with his first opportunity to publicly acknowledge his grief and to hear others share their memories of the woman they lost. The university chapel is packed with students and faculty members who knew Gwen or who simply want to express their condolences and their sadness at such a young life being cut short. The atmosphere is heavy with collective mourning, the kind of shared grief that emerges when a community loses one of its brightest members. The speakers who stand at the podium to share their memories of Gwen paint a portrait of someone who touched many lives through her kindness and her genuine interest in others. Professors describe her academic excellence and her thoughtful contributions to class discussions. Fellow students talk about her willingness to help with difficult assignments, her ability to make everyone feel included and valued, her infectious laugh, and her optimistic outlook on life. Each story adds another dimension to Peter's understanding of who Gwen was and how many people will miss her presence in their lives. Peter's own turn at the podium comes near the end of the service, and he approaches it with legs that feel unsteady and a heart that pounds with anxiety and grief. The words he has prepared, written and rewritten dozens of times in the days since Gwen's death, suddenly seem inadequate to the task of capturing who she was and what she meant to him. But he forces himself to speak anyway, his voice rough with emotion but growing stronger as he continues, telling the assembled mourners about Gwen's belief in the goodness of people and her commitment to making the world a better place through science and education. The story that Peter shares about Gwen's dedication to tutoring disadvantaged students in science and her dream of developing educational programs that would make scientific knowledge accessible to everyone regardless of their background or circumstances, illustrates the depth of her compassion and the scope of her ambitions. He describes how she believed that understanding the natural world was not just an academic exercise, but a tool for improving human lives and solving practical problems. He talks about her patient explanations of complex concepts, her ability to find exactly the right metaphor or example to make difficult ideas comprehensible, her joy when students experienced those moments of clarity and understanding. The conclusion of Peter's remarks, delivered through tears that he makes no attempt to hide, focuses on the legacy that Gwen leaves behind and the responsibility of those who knew her to honour her memory through their actions. He challenges the assembled students and faculty to ask themselves what Gwen would want them to do with the time they have been given, how she would want them to respond to this tragedy. Would she want them to become bitter or cynical, to retreat from engagement with the world? Or would she want them to double down on their commitments to kindness, to service, to the pursuit of knowledge and the betterment of human existence? The applause that follows Peter's remarks is muted and respectful, acknowledging the truth of his words while also honouring the solemnity of the occasion. As he returns to his seat, several people reach out to touch his arm or shoulder in gestures of sympathy and solidarity, offering wordless comfort and recognition of his loss. The weight of their compassion is both comforting and unbearable, a reminder that he is not alone in his grief, but also that grief shared is still grief, still painful, still the constant ache of absence and longing. The private funeral service that takes place 2 days after the university memorial is smaller and more intimate, limited to Gwen's immediate family and her closest friends. The funeral home chapel where the service is held is filled with flowers, hundreds of arrangements sent by people who knew Gwen or who simply want to express their sympathy to her family. The overwhelming abundance of blooms creates a garden-like atmosphere that feels both beautiful and suffocating, the sweet scent of roses and lilies mixing with the underlying smell of grief and loss. The closed casket at the front of the chapel is a simple but elegant affair, dark wood polished to a high shine and covered with a spray of white roses that were Gwen's favourite flowers. Peter stares at that casket throughout the service, his mind unable to fully accept that Gwen's body lies within it, that the vibrant living person he loved has been reduced to remains that will soon be committed to the earth. The finality of death, the absolute and irreversible nature of what has happened, crashes over him in waves of realization that leave him gasping for emotional breath. Captain Stacy's eulogy for his daughter is brief and heartbreaking in its restraint, the words of a father trying to maintain his composure while speaking about the child he will never see grow into full adulthood. He describes Gwen's childhood, her curiosity and her compassion, the way she approached every challenge with determination and optimism. He talks about his pride in her accomplishments and his joy in watching her become the remarkable woman that she was. And he speaks, his voice finally breaking about the unfairness of her death and the hole that her absence will leave in the lives of everyone who loved her. The final viewing of Gwen's body, which Captain Stacy allows for immediate family and a handful of close friends, including Peter, takes place in a small room adjacent to the chapel. Peter approaches the open casket with dread and longing in equal measure, needing to see her one last time but terrified of what that sight will do to his fragile emotional state. The woman lying in the casket is recognizable as Gwen, her features composed and peaceful. Her golden hair arranged carefully around her face, but something essential is missing, some quality of animation and presence that made her who she was. This is Gwen's body, but Gwen herself is gone. Peter's goodbye to Gwen, whispered too quietly for anyone else to hear, is simple and heartfelt and utterly insufficient to everything he wants to say. He tells her that he loves her, that he's sorry he couldn't save her, that he will carry her memory with him for the rest of his life. He promises to honour her legacy by continuing to fight for the kind of world she believed in, to use his powers and his abilities to protect others from the kind of senseless tragedy that claimed her life. The tears that fall onto the casket's edge are hot and bitter, physical manifestations of grief that cannot be contained or controlled. The burial takes place in a cemetery on the outskirts of the city, a peaceful expanse of rolling green hills dotted with headstones and memorial markers that stretch as far as the eye can see. The plot that the Stacy family has chosen for Gwen is located beneath a large oak tree, its branches providing shade and a sense of natural shelter that somehow makes the finality of burial feel slightly less harsh. The grave itself, a dark rectangle of earth waiting to receive its burden, seems impossibly deep and final, a physical manifestation of the separation between the living and the dead. The gathering of mourners around the gravesite is smaller than the group that attended the funeral service, consisting primarily of immediate family members and the handful of friends deemed close enough to be included in this most intimate moment of farewell. Peter stands slightly apart from the main group, not quite family, but too intimately connected to Gwen's life to be classified as merely a friend. His position reflects his complicated relationship to her death, simultaneously central to what happened and peripheral to the family's official grieving process. The minister's words at the graveside are traditional and comforting, drawing on familiar religious language about eternal life and the hope of resurrection. He speaks of Gwen's soul being at peace, of her earthly struggles being ended, of the faith that allows believers to trust in eventual reunion with their departed loved ones. Peter listens to these assurances with a mixture of desperate hope and profound skepticism, wanting to believe that death is not the absolute end, but unable to find that kind of faith in the midst of his grief and guilt. The lowering of the casket into the ground happens with mechanical precision, the funeral home workers operating the device that slowly descends Gwen's remains into the earth with practiced efficiency. The sound of the straps moving through the pulleys, the slight scrape of wood against dirt as the casket settles into its final position. These mundane mechanical noises create a soundtrack for the moment that makes everything feel more real and more terrible. This is actually happening. Gwen is actually being buried. The woman Peter loved is being placed in the ground, covered with earth, removed forever from the world of light and air and living things. The tradition of throwing earth onto the casket, each mourner taking a handful of dirt and tossing it into the grave as a final gesture of farewell, feels simultaneously ancient and unbearable. Captain Stacy goes first, his hand trembling as he releases the soil and watches it scatter across the top of his daughter's casket. Gwen's mother follows, her grief so overwhelming that she can barely stand and must be supported by relatives on either side. One by one, the assembled mourners approach the grave, perform their ritual, and step back to make room for the next person. Peter's turn comes near the end, and he approaches the grave with legs that feel like they might give out at any moment. The earth he gathers in his hand is cool and slightly damp, rich soil that will eventually nourish the grass that will grow over Gwen's grave and hide all evidence that the ground was ever disturbed. The act of releasing that soil, of watching it fall onto the casket and knowing that soon tons more earth will follow to cover and conceal and separate forever, breaks something inside Peter that he didn't know could still break after everything else he has endured. The walk away from the gravesite, leaving Gwen behind while the workers begin the process of filling in the grave, is one of the most difficult things Peter has ever done. Every step feels like a betrayal, an abandonment of someone who trusted him and depended on him. The rational part of his mind understands that Gwen is beyond caring whether he stays or goes, that her consciousness has ended and she has no awareness of being left alone in that hole in the ground. But the emotional reality of walking away from her grave, of leaving her there in the gathering dusk while he returns to the world of the living, creates an anguish that threatens to bring him to his knees. The reception that follows the burial, held at the Stacy home for the benefit of the mourners who have travelled from out of town, or who need the comfort of company and conversation after the ordeal of the funeral, is a study in the strange social rituals that surround death. People gather in small groups, speaking in hushed tones about Gwen and about the tragedy of her death, offering each other the kind of comfort that comes from shared grief and mutual support. Food appears on tables, brought by neighbours and friends who express their sympathy through casseroles and baked goods, as if feeding the bereaved could somehow ease the pain of loss. Peter moves through the reception like a ghost, present in body but disconnected from the conversations and interactions happening around him. People approach to offer condolences, to share memories of Gwen, to express their sympathy for his loss. He responds with appropriate words and gestures, thanking them for their kindness and acknowledging their sentiments, but none of it penetrates the numbness that has settled over him like a protective shell. The only thing that feels real is the constant ache in his chest where his heart should be, the physical manifestation of grief that no amount of sympathy or support can ease. Harry's presence at the reception is noted by several people who whisper among themselves about the awkwardness of having Norman Osborn's son present at the funeral of the woman Norman murdered. Harry himself seems oblivious to the uncomfortable glances and hushed comments, lost in his own world of grief and shame and confusion. He sits alone in a corner of the living room, a glass of whiskey in his hand despite the early hour, staring at nothing and responding to any attempts at conversation with monosyllabic answers that discourage further interaction. The moment when Harry approaches Peter, his movements unsteady and his eyes unfocused from the alcohol he has consumed, creates a tension that silences the nearby conversations and draws uncomfortable attention. Harry's words, slurred but heartfelt, express sorrow for what his father did and shame at bearing the Osborn name in the wake of such terrible actions. He tells Peter that he understands if Peter hates him, if he can never forgive the association between Harry and the man who killed Gwen. The desperation in Harry's voice, the need for absolution, or at least acknowledgement that he is not responsible for his father's crimes, creates a complex emotional situation that Peter is ill-equipped to handle in his current state. Peter's response to Harry, delivered quietly so that the other mourners cannot hear, focuses on the distinction between inherited guilt and personal responsibility. He tells Harry that Norman's actions are Norman's alone, that a father's crimes do not transfer to his children, that their friendship does not need to be destroyed by what Norman has done. The words are true and heartfelt, but Peter also recognizes the complicated reality that seeing Harry's face will always remind him of Norman, that the friendship they shared has been fundamentally altered by events beyond their control. The embrace that Harry initiates, clinging to Peter with the desperation of someone drowning and grasping for anything that might keep him afloat, is awkward and public and necessary for them both. The two young men stand together in the middle of the Stacy living room, holding each other while the assembled mourners pretend not to watch, sharing grief that takes different forms but springs from the same terrible source. Peter can feel Harry shaking with suppressed sobs, can smell the alcohol on his breath, and the unwashed staleness that speaks of depression and self-neglect, and he feels his own grief expand to include sorrow for what his friend is going through. The conversation that Peter has with Captain Stacy before leaving the reception focuses on practical matters and future plans, a welcome relief from the emotional intensity of the day's earlier events. The captain thanks Peter for his eulogy at the University Memorial, for his support during the difficult days of preparation, for being someone who truly loved Gwen and understood who she was. He asks Peter to stay in touch, to visit when he feels able, to maintain the connection between them that was forged through their shared love for Gwen and their mutual commitment to honouring her memory. The question that Captain Stacy asks, delivered with careful casualness that doesn't quite hide its importance, concerns Peter's plans for continuing his education and his life in the wake of this tragedy. He expresses concern that Peter might drop out of school or make decisions based on grief, rather than on thoughtful consideration of his future. He reminds Peter that Gwen would want him to complete his degree, to pursue his dreams, to build the kind of life that honours her memory through its dedication to service and the pursuit of knowledge. Peter's assurance that he intends to continue his education and his work, while true in the broad sense, feels hollow even as he speaks the words. How can he simply return to classes and laboratories and the normal routines of student life when everything has changed so fundamentally? How can he sit in the places where he and Gwen used to study together, walk the paths they walked, exist in spaces that are haunted by memories of her presence? The practical necessity of moving forward conflicts with the emotional impossibility of doing so, creating a tension that Peter has no idea how to resolve. The night that falls as Peter finally leaves the Stacy home and begins the journey back to his apartment is cool and clear, the city spread out below him as he swings through the darkened streets. The familiar rhythm of web slinging, the physical exertion and the focus required to navigate the urban landscape, provides a kind of meditation that allows his mind to process the day's events without being overwhelmed by their emotional weight. The movement through space becomes a metaphor for movement through grief, each swing carrying him forward into a future that he cannot yet imagine, but must somehow find the strength to face. The encounter with a mugging in progress, witnessed during Peter's journey home, creates a moment of decision about whether he is ready to resume his activities as Spider-Man, or whether the weight of his failure to save Gwen has broken something essential in his ability to function as a hero. The young woman being threatened by two men with knives represents exactly the kind of innocent person that Spider-Man exists to protect, and Peter's spider sense screams warnings about the danger she faces. But the memory of Gwen's death, the terrible proof that even Spider-Man's powers are not sufficient to save everyone, creates hesitation and doubt about whether his intervention will help or whether it will somehow make things worse. The decision to intervene comes not from confidence in his abilities or faith in positive outcomes, but from the simple recognition that standing aside while someone suffers harm is not an option that Peter Parker can live with. Uncle Ben's lessons about responsibility and the commitments Peter made at Gwen's graveside about honouring her memory through continued service override his doubts and fears. He descends from his webline with practiced grace, his body moving through familiar combat patterns while his mind remains partially disconnected from what he is doing. The fight itself is brief and efficient, Spider-Man's superior abilities making quick work of the would-be muggers and leaving them webbed to a lamppost for police to collect. The young woman he saves is effusive in her gratitude, thanking him repeatedly and calling him a hero, her words creating a complicated mix of emotions in Peter's chest. He accepts her thanks with a quiet acknowledgement, then swings away before she can say anything more, unable to handle praise or admiration when he feels so completely like a failure. The apartment he returns to is dark and quiet. Harry apparently still at the reception, or perhaps having gone elsewhere to drown his sorrows in alcohol and solitude. Peter is grateful for the privacy, for the opportunity to remove his Spider-Man costume and simply be Peter Parker, alone with his thoughts and his grief. The shower he takes is long and hot, the water providing minimal comfort but at least giving him something to focus on besides the constant replay of memories and regrets. The sleep that finally claims Peter in the early hours of the morning is fitful and filled with nightmares, his subconscious mind processing the day's events through dreams that mix reality with terrible fantasy. He dreams of Gwen falling again and again, sometimes catching her successfully and sometimes watching helplessly as she plummets past his outstretched hand. He dreams of the funeral, except in these visions Gwen sits up in her casket and asks him why he let her die, why his powers weren't enough to save her, why he thinks he deserves to call himself a hero when he failed at the most important moment. The morning that breaks through Peter's window finds him exhausted and emotionally drained, but also grimly determined to continue moving forward despite the weight of his grief and guilt. Gwen is gone, taken from the world by a madman's revenge and by the terrible mathematics of physics applied to human fragility. Nothing Peter does can change that fact or bring her back or undo the events on the Brooklyn Bridge. But he can choose how he responds to this tragedy, can decide whether to let it destroy him or whether to transform it into motivation for continued service and dedication to protecting others. The choice, when Peter articulates it to himself in the quiet of his room, is both simple and impossibly difficult. He can give up, can abandon his role as Spider-Man and retreat into normal civilian life, accepting that some tragedies cannot be prevented and some people cannot be saved. Or he can continue fighting, can take the lesson of Gwen's death and use it to make himself more determined, more careful, more committed to ensuring that other people do not suffer similar fates. The path forward requires him to carry the weight of his failure alongside the weight of his responsibilities, to accept that being a hero means sometimes falling short of your goals, while still maintaining faith in the value of the effort. And so we come to the end of this heartbreaking chapter in Spider-Man's story, a tale that reminds us that even heroes cannot save everyone, that even the greatest powers have limits, and that love and loss are two sides of the same precious coin. We have walked with Peter Parker through the brightest moments of his life and through the darkest valley of grief, watching as he learned that responsibility sometimes means carrying the weight of failures alongside the pride of victories. Gwen Stacy's golden light touched everyone who knew her, and though that light was extinguished far too soon, its warmth continues to illuminate the path forward for those who loved her. The bridge stands as a monument to a moment when heroism met tragedy, when love confronted loss, when the limitations of power became painfully, irrevocably clear. But it also stands as a reminder that we continue, that we carry our grief and our memories forward into whatever future awaits us, that the people we have loved shape who we become even after they are gone. Peter Parker will rise again, will swing through the city's canyons again, will save lives and protect the innocent again, because that is what heroes do. They fall and they rise, they fail and they try again. They lose what they love most, and still they find reasons to hope. Let this story carry you now into peaceful sleep, knowing that even in the darkest moments, the human spirit endures. Rest easy, true believers, and remember that with great love comes great loss, but also great meaning. The web connects us all, the living and the dead, the heroes and those they could not save. Sweet dreams, and may you always remember that every ending contains the seeds of new beginnings. Every loss carries within it the memory of what was cherished, and every night, no matter how dark, eventually gives way to morning.